Gabriel José García Márquez was born on March 6, 1928 in Aracata, although his father contends that it was really 1927. Because his parents were still poor and struggling, his grandparents accepted the task of raising him, a common practice at that time. Unfortunately, 1928 was the last year of the banana boom in Aracataca. The strike and its brutal reprisal hit the town hard. Over 100 strikers were shot one night in Aracataca and dumped into a common grave. It was a sad start to his life, one that would later resurface in his writing. Nicknamed Gabito, little Gabriel grew up as a quiet and shy lad, entranced by his grandfather's stories and his grandmother's superstitions. Aside from the colonel and himself, it was a house of women, and later García Márquez would later remark that their beliefs had him afraid to leave his chair, half terrified of ghosts. And yet all the seeds of his future work were planted in that household. Stories of the Civil War and the Banana Massacre, the courtship of his parents, the sturdy practicality of the superstitious matriarch, the comings and goings of aunts, great-aunts, and his grandfather's illegitimate daughters. Later, García Márquez would write, "I knew that all my writing has been about the experiences of the time I spent with my grandparents." His grandfather died when he was 8 years old, and due to his grandmother's increasing blindness, he went to live with his parents in Sucre, where his father was working as a pharmacist. Soon after he arrived in Sucre, it was decided that he should begin his formal schooling. He was sent to a boarding school in Barranquilla, a port city at the mouth of the Magdalena River. There he acquired a reputation as being a shy boy who wrote humorous poems and drew cartoons. So serious and non-athletic was he that he was nicknamed the Old Man by his classmates. In 1940, when he was 12, he was awarded a scholarship to a secondary school for gifted students run by Jesuits. In school, he found himself growing quite stimulated by his studies, and in the evening he often read books aloud to his companions in the dormitory. And, much to his amusement, even though he had yet to write anything significant, his great love of literature and his cartoons and stories helped him to acquire a reputation as a writer. Perhaps this reputation provided him with a star by which to steer the ship of his imagination, and he would need it, for after graduation in 1946, the 18-year-old writer followed his parents' wishes and enrolled in the Universidad Nacional in Bogotá as a law student rather than as a journalist. It was during this time that García Márquez met his future wife. While visiting his parents, he was introduced to a 13-year-old girl named Mercedes Parcha Pardo. Dark and silent, of Egyptian descent, she was the most interesting person he had ever met. After he graduated from the Liceo Nacional, he took a small vacation with his parents before leaving for the university. During that time, he proposed to her. Agreeing, but first wishing to finish primary school, she put off the engagement. Although they wouldn't be married for another 14 years, Mercedes promised to stay true to him. Like many great writers attending college for a subject they despised, García Márquez found that he had absolutely no interest in his studies, and he became something of a consummate slacker. He began to skip classes and neglect both his studies and himself, electing to wander around Bogotá and ride the streetcars, reading poetry instead of law. He ate in cheap cafes, smoked cigarettes, and associated with all the usual suspects: literate socialists, starving artists, and budding journalists. One day, however, his life changed. all from just reading a simple book. As if all the lines of fate suddenly converged in his hands, he was given a copy of Kafka's The Metamorphosis, translated by none other than Jorge Luis Borges. The book had a profound effect on García Márquez, making him aware that literature did not have to follow a straight narrative and unfold a traditional plot. The effect was liberating. I thought to myself that I didn't know anyone was allowed to write things like that. If I had known, I would have started writing a long time ago. He also remarked that Kafka's voice had the same echoes of his grandmother's. That's how my grandmother used to tell stories, the wildest things with a completely natural tone of voice. One of the first things he set out to do was catch up on all the literature he had been missing. He began reading voraciously, devouring everything he could get his hands on. He also began writing, and to his surprise, his first story, The Third Resignation, was published in 1946 by the liberal Bogotá newspaper El Espectador, and the editor even hailed him as the new genius of Colombian letters. García Márquez entered a period of creativity, penning 10 more stories for the newspaper over the next few years. In 1959, García Márquez's first son, Rodrigo, was born, and the family moved to New York City, where he supervised the North American branch of Prensa Latina, where he laboured under death threats from angry Americans and an increasing sense of disillusionment at the ideological rifts occurring in Cuba's Communist Party. He resigned his position later that year and moved his family to Mexico City, travelling through the South on a Faulknerian pilgrimage. He would be denied entrance in the US again until 1971. And then it happened, his epiphany. In January 1965, he and his family were driving to Acapulco for a vacation when the inspiration struck him. He had found his tone. For the first time in 20 years, a stroke of lightning clearly illuminated Macondo. He would later write, "All of a sudden, I don't know why, I had this illumination on how to write the book. I had it so completely formed that right there I could have dictated the first chapter word by word to a typist." And later, regarding that illumination, the tone that I eventually used in 100 Years of Solitude was based on the way my grandmother used to tell stories. She told things that sounded supernatural and fantastic, but she told them with complete naturalness. What was most important was the expression she had on her face. She did not change her expression at all when telling her stories, and everyone was surprised. In previous attempts to write, I tried to tell the story without believing in it. I discovered that what I had to do was believe in them myself and write them with the same expression with which my grandmother told them, with a brick face. He turned the car immediately around and headed home. There he put Mercedes in charge of the family, and he retired to his room to write. He wrote every day for 18 months, consuming up to 6 packs of cigarettes a day. To provide for the family, the car was sold, and almost every household appliance was pawned so Mercedes could feed the family and keep him supplied with a constant river of paper and cigarettes. His friends started to call his smoke-filled room the cave of the mafia. And after a while, the whole community began helping out, as if they collectively understood that he was creating a masterpiece. Credit was extended, appliances loaned, debts forgiven. After nearly a year of work, García Márquez sent the first 3 chapters to Carlos Fuentes, who publicly declared, "I have just read 80 pages from a master." Towards the end of the novel, as yet unnamed, anticipation grew, and the buzz of success was in the air. As finishing touches, he placed himself, his wife, and his friends in the novel, and then discovered a name on the last page. Cien años de soledad. Finally he emerged from the cave, grasping 1,300 pages in his hands, exhausted and almost poisoned from nicotine, over $10,000 in debt, and perhaps only a few pages shy of a mental and physical breakdown. And yet he was happy, euphoric. In need of postage, he pawned a few more household implements and sent it off to the publishers in Buenos Aires. 100 Years of Solitude was published in June 1967, and within a week all 8,000 copies were gone. From that point on, success was assured, and the novel sold out of a new printing each week, going on to sell 500,000 copies within 3 years. It was translated into over 24 languages, and it won 4 international prizes. Success had come at last. Gabriel García Márquez was 39 years old when the world learned his name. Suddenly he was beset by fame, fan mail, awards, interviews, appearances. It was obvious that his life had changed. In 1969, the novel won the Cianciano Prize in Italy and was named the best foreign book in France. In 1970, it was published in English and was chosen as one of the best 12 books of the year in the United States. 2 years later, he was awarded the Romulo Gallegos Prize and the Neustadt Prize, and in 1971, a Peruvian writer named Mario Vargas Llosa even published a book about his life and work. To counter all his exposure, García Márquez simply returned to writing, deciding that he would write about a dictator. He moved his family to Barcelona in Spain, which was spending its last years under the boot of Francisco Franco. There he laboured on his next work, a work that would pin down a composite dictator, a Caribbean dictator with Stalin's smooth hands and the solipsistic will of an archetypical Latin American tyrant. In the meantime, Innocent Erendira and Other Stories was published in 1972 and in 1973. He put out a collection of his journalist work from the late 50s, Cuando era feliz e indocumentado, or When I Was Happy and Uninformed. Autumn of the Patriarch was published in 1975, and it was a drastic departure from the prose style of 100 Years of Solitude. A winding book with labyrinthine sentences, it was initially considered a disappointment by the critics, who were most likely expecting another Macondo. Opinion has changed over the years, however, and many now consider this novel of shifting realities to be a minor masterpiece of prose. Living in a dictatorship and writing a novel about a tyrant took their emotional toll over the years. By the end of the novel, García Márquez had decided that he could write no more fiction until the American-supported Pinochet stepped down from his dictatorship of Chile, a decision he later discarded. He was becoming more aware of his own political power as a well-known writer, and his increased clout and financial security enabled him to pursue his interests in political activism. Returning to Mexico City, he purchased a new house and stepped up his personal campaign to affect the politics of the world around him. Continuing his actions of the last few years, he continued to funnel some of his money into political and social causes. Through his writings and donations, he supported leftist causes in Colombia, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Argentina, and Angola. He helped found and strongly supported Habeas, an organization dedicated to correcting the abuses of Latin American power and freeing political prisoners, and he struck up friendships with such leaders as Omar Torrijos of Panama and continued his relationship with Fidel Castro of Cuba. Needless to say, these activities did not endear him to the hearts of politicians in either the US or in Colombia. All his visits to the US were on a limited visa and had to be approved by the State Department. In 1977, he published Operación Carlota, a series of essays on Cuba's role in Africa. Ironically, although he claims to be quite good friends with Castro, who even helped him edit Chronicle of a Death Foretold, he spent the late 70s writing a very harsh, very frank book about the shortcomings of the Cuban Revolution and of life under Castro's regime. This book has not yet been published, and García Márquez has claimed that he is holding it until relations between Cuba and the United States are somewhat normalized. In 1981, the year in which he was awarded the French Legion of Honor Medal, he returned to Colombia from a visit with Castro, and there he found out that he was in trouble. The conservative government was accusing him of financing the M19, a liberal group of guerrillas. Fleeing Colombia, he asked for and received political asylum in Mexico, where he lives to this day. Colombia would soon regret their anger at their famous son. However, in 1982, he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. Embarrassed and having just elected a new president, Colombia invited him back, and President Betancourt personally saw him off to Stockholm. In 1982, he assisted a friend in publishing El Odor de la Guayaba, or The Fragrance of Guava, a book of conversations with his longtime friend and colleague, Plinio Apuelo Mendoza, and in the same year he wrote Viva Sandino, a screenplay about the Sandinistas and the Nicaraguan Revolution. Politics, however, would be far from his mind for his next work of fiction, which would be a love story. Turning again to his rich past for inspiration and material, he reworked his parents' strange courtship into the form of a decade-spanning narrative. The story would be about two frustrated lovers and the long tome between their second courtship. And in 1986, Love in the Time of Cholera was unveiled to the anxious world. It was highly received, and there was no question that García Márquez had become a writer with universal appeal. By now one of the most famous writers in the world, he eased into a lifestyle of writing, teaching, and political activism. With residences in Mexico City, Cuernavaca, Paris, Barcelona, and Barranquilla, he finished the decade by publishing The General in His Labyrinth in 1990. And 2 years later, Strange Pilgrims was born. In 1994, he published his most recent work of fiction, Love and Other Demons. Today, García Márquez lives with Mercedes in Mexico City, where he has quit smoking and is in the perpetual state of writing a novel.